November 1973, Chicago, Illinois. The corner of 69th and Green. The body was found face down on the pavement before sunrise. No wallet, no identification, no witnesses, at least, none who were talking. His name was William Young, 23 years old, a mid-level street operator in one of the most disciplined criminal organizations the American Midwest had ever produced. He had made one mistake, not a business mistake, not an act of disloyalty to the organization, something older than organized crime itself. He had touched the wrong woman. The man whose woman he touched was not present at the scene. He was not in the city. He was not even free. He was sitting inside a federal penitentiary, convicted, caged, and supposedly powerless. And yet, William Young was dead. What investigators could not yet comprehend, what would take them 2 more decades to fully understand, was that the order to kill him had traveled through prison walls, through intermediaries, through a chain of absolute obedience, and landed on that Chicago street corner with surgical precision. The man who gave that order controlled an army of thousands. He ran a criminal empire generating millions annually. He directed murders, managed territory, and set organizational policy, all from a prison cell. His name was Larry Hoover. And this story does not begin with his imprisonment. It begins long before the walls closed in. He was not born into crime. That is the detail most accounts erase because it complicates the narrative. It is easier to cast Larry Hoover as a product of pure malice. The truth is more unsettling. Larry Hoover was born on the 30th of November 1950 in Jackson, Mississippi. The American South was still a geography of sanctioned humiliation for black families. Jim Crow was not a historical abstraction. It was the texture of daily life. Separate entrances, separate futures. His family moved north when he was 4 years old. Chicago promised something different. What it delivered was the West Side, a neighborhood already being systematically dismantled by urban policy decisions that concentrated poverty, withdrew investment, and left entire communities to govern themselves by whatever rules survived the abandonment. By his early teens, Hoover was running with street gangs, not out of romance. Out of the same logic that has driven young men into organized violence across every civilization in recorded history, the logic of belonging, protection, and visible power in a world that had assigned him invisibility. He was intelligent, unusually so. Those who knew him described a man who read, who strategized, who understood hierarchy instinctively. That mind would build an empire. It would also, eventually, consume one. In 1960s Chicago, the street gang landscape was not chaos. It was geography made violent. Territories were drawn with the precision of municipal boundaries. Alliances were negotiated like treaties. Betrayals were punished like treason. The city's south side had become a sovereign underworld, and into that world, a teenage Larry Hoover stepped with uncommon clarity of purpose. He aligned early with David Barksdale, the founder of the Black Disciples, a man whose organizational instincts matched Hoover's own. Together, in 1969, they merged their respective factions into a single consolidated entity. They called it the Gangster Disciples. The merger was not merely symbolic, it was structural genius. What Hoover understood, what separated him from the ordinary street operator, was that longevity required organization, not just muscle, organization. The Gangster Disciples developed a hierarchy modeled, deliberately, on corporate and military structures. There were ranks, there were rules, there were consequences for deviation that were applied with consistency. Members paid dues. Territory was managed like franchise operations. Revenue streams were diversified across drug distribution, extortion, and legitimate business fronts. At its peak, the organization would claim presence in 35 states and membership exceeding 30,000 individuals. Hoover sat at the apex of this structure not as a figurehead, but as an operational architect. He knew names, he knew numbers, he remembered everything. Then, in 1973, at 23 years old, everything changed. A murder conviction, a life sentence. And yet the organization did not collapse. It expanded. August 1973, Cook County Criminal Court, Chicago, Illinois. Larry Hoover was convicted of the murder of William Young, a rival gang member killed over a drug dispute on the South Side. The sentence was 150 to 200 years in the Illinois state penitentiary system. The prosecution believed they had decapitated the organization. They had miscalculated entirely. What investigators failed to understand was that Hoover had not built a criminal enterprise dependent on his physical presence. He had built a system. Systems do not require their architects to remain free. They require only that the architect remains connected, and Hoover, despite his incarceration, remained extraordinarily connected. From inside Stateville Correctional Center, he continued to issue directives. Lieutenants visited under the pretense of legal consultations. Messages moved through layers of intermediaries' wives, attorneys, trusted associates with a discipline that would have impressed any intelligence agency studying the operation from the outside. The prison itself became a secondary headquarters. Hoover reorganized the Gangster Disciples from his cell with the same methodical precision he had applied on the streets. He restructured ranks. He resolved disputes. He approved expansions into new territories. He ordered violence when he deemed it necessary, and he deemed it necessary often. The state of Illinois had removed him from Chicago. Chicago had not noticed. The money still moved. The orders still landed. The fear, perhaps the most essential currency of all, remained completely intact. The 1990s arrived with a paradox. Larry Hoover, convicted murderer, imprisoned crime lord, architect of one of the most sophisticated street organizations in American history, was being discussed in the halls of Illinois state government, not merely as a criminal problem, but as a potential solution. This was not naivety. This was politics in its most transactional form. By the early 1990s, Chicago's South Side was hemorrhaging. Gang violence had metastasized beyond anything municipal law enforcement could contain through conventional means. Politicians needed results. Community leaders needed peace. And somewhere inside Stateville Correctional Center, Larry Hoover had begun presenting himself deliberately, strategically, as a man transformed. He rebranded the Gangster Disciples. The organization was publicly repositioned as Growth and Development, a community-focused entity committed to political engagement, voter registration, and neighborhood rebuilding. Hoover cultivated relationships with Chicago aldermen, civil rights figures, and community organizers. He gave interviews. He spoke the language of rehabilitation with fluency and conviction. It was a masterful performance, and the uncomfortable truth is that it was not entirely fiction. Hoover did register thousands of voters. The organization did engage in legitimate community programming. The line between genuine reform and calculated image management was deliberately blurred, because a blurred line served Hoover's purposes far more effectively than a clean one. Politicians who sought his influence delivered something invaluable in return: legitimacy. Proximity to civic power created a shield. It complicated the narrative that federal prosecutors were attempting to construct. It generated grassroots pressure against what supporters framed as politically motivated persecution of a rehabilitated black leader. In 1993, a coalition of community leaders and elected officials petitioned Illinois Governor Jim Edgar for Hoover's release. The petition carried genuine weight. It reflected genuine public sentiment in communities that had watched Hoover's organization deliver visible results that the state apparatus had failed to produce. Governor Edgar refused. The federal government had been watching the entire performance with cold, patient attention. What Hoover had not fully calculated was that every political connection he cultivated, every public appearance he orchestrated, every demonstration of his continued influence and reach was being documented, filed, analyzed. He had made himself impossible to ignore. And in Washington, the agencies that could not ignore him had begun to move. The rebranding that was meant to secure his freedom had illuminated, with devastating clarity, exactly how much power he still commanded. That illumination would cost him everything. Power, at its most absolute, is also at its most fragile. This is the paradox that history returns to repeatedly in boardrooms, in royal courts, in military commands, and in the hierarchies of organized crime. The man who controls everything controls it through human beings. Betrayal that detonated inside the Gangster Disciples hierarchy was not ideological. It was not a rival power grab disguised as principled dissent. It was something rawer and older than organized crime itself. A trusted lieutenant, a man elevated by Hoover's own hand, granted authority by Hoover's own word, had entered into a relationship with a woman connected to Hoover personally. The precise details, in the manner of all things that move through criminal organizations, were communicated in fragments and whispers. But the conclusion was unambiguous. The lieutenant had violated the most fundamental boundary an organization built on loyalty could draw. He had reached into the private life of the man who had given him everything. Inside the Gangster Disciples, this was not merely personal transgression. It was organizational heresy. It signaled to every rank below that the king's authority, even his most intimate authority, was negotiable. Hoover could not allow that signal to stand. He could not afford hesitation. He could not afford proportion. What followed was neither proportionate nor hesitant. The order did not arrive as a single command. That is what made it so difficult to prosecute. That is what made it so devastating to survive. It moved the way all of Hoover's directives moved, through layers, through intermediaries, through a chain of transmission so disciplined that each individual link could claim ignorance of the full picture. A word here, an instruction there. A name passed through a visiting room conversation that never appeared on any recorded transcript. But the cumulative effect was unambiguous. What federal prosecutors would later document through years of surveillance, informant testimony, and intercepted communications was a killing campaign of extraordinary scope. The lieutenant who had violated Hoover's personal boundary was the original target. He did not survive. But Hoover did not stop there. Anyone connected to the betrayal was identified. Anyone who had known and remained silent was identified. Anyone whose loyalty had become, in Hoover's calculation, theoretically questionable in the aftermath was identified. The organization moved against them with the same systematic precision it applied to territorial expansion and revenue collection. By the time federal investigators had assembled a complete picture, the body count directly attributable to orders issued from Hoover's prison cell had reached 95 individuals. 95. Not in the chaos of open gang warfare, not as collateral casualties of territorial dispute, but as the result of deliberate, considered, administratively processed decisions made by a man serving a life sentence inside an Illinois correctional facility. The personal had become organizational policy. A single act of intimate betrayal had triggered a machinery of violence so vast it consumed nearly 100 lives. This was not rage. Rage is temporary and imprecise. This was governance, and it was this distinction between passion and policy that would finally bring the full weight of the federal government down upon Larry Hoover's world. The federal government named it Operation Headache. The title was deliberate, bureaucratically understated in the way that serious federal operations often are, masking the enormity of what was actually being assembled behind the bland language of administrative procedure. Because what the FBI, the DEA, and the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois had constructed was not a routine criminal investigation. It was a dismantling. For years, federal agencies had been building a case architecture of extraordinary complexity. Wiretaps, informants cultivated at multiple levels of the Gangster Disciples hierarchy. Financial forensics tracing revenue flows across legitimate business fronts and street-level drug operations simultaneously. Surveillance that mapped the communication channels through which Hoover's directives traveled from his prison cell outward into 35 states. The investigators had learned to read the organization the way Hoover himself read it, structurally, systematically, with patience. In 1995, the operation culminated in a federal indictment that was, by any measure, staggering in its scope. Hoover and 38 co-defendants were charged under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. The charges encompassed drug conspiracy, murder, extortion, and the continued direction of a criminal enterprise from federal custody. The RICO statute was the instrument specifically designed for this architecture of crime. It did not require prosecutors to prove that Hoover personally pulled a trigger. It required only that they demonstrate he had directed an ongoing criminal enterprise, and the evidence assembled under Operation Headache demonstrated precisely that, with a comprehensiveness that left the defense with almost no viable ground to contest. In 1997, Larry Hoover was convicted on all federal charges. He was sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms, added to the sentence he was already serving. He was transferred to ADX Florence in Colorado, the federal government's most restrictive supermax facility, a place designed with one specific architectural purpose: to ensure that the man inside it could reach no one on the outside. No more visiting room conversations, no more layered message systems, No more organizational directives traveling through intermediaries. The communication chain that had sustained his empire for over 2 decades was surgically severed. But the fallout did not end with his transfer. The Gangster Disciples, leaderless at the top for the first time in a generation, fractured. Splinter factions emerged. Territory that had been held under centralized discipline dissolved into localized, unpredictable violence that proved, in many respects, more dangerous to Chicago's communities than the organized hierarchy it replaced. Order, even criminal order, has consequences when it collapses. The streets that Hoover had governed from a distance did not become peaceful in his absence. They became ungovernable. Return to that Chicago street corner, November 1973. William Young's body cooling on the pavement before sunrise. A young man dead over the oldest human transgression: desire, boundary, consequence. That moment contained everything that followed. 95 deaths, federal indictments, a supermax cell in Colorado, an empire's collapse into ungovernable fragments. Larry Hoover never needed freedom to exercise power. That is the truth that unsettles every assumption we hold about incarceration as consequence. The walls contained his body. They contained nothing else. What his story reveals is not the exceptional nature of one man's criminality, but the predictable failure of systems that concentrate poverty, withdraw opportunity, and then express genuine surprise when the human need for order, belonging, and power finds its own architects. Hoover built what the abandoned city refused to build. The tragedy is not that he was powerful. The tragedy is why he had to be.